Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I ask you to take a seat, please? So, welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear supporters and friends of SBI. It is really my big pleasure today to open this day of science networking for polar research. It's really networking among Swiss polar research, the Swiss polar research community. And this is especially exciting because we have more than half of the people here in the room that have never attended an SBI event before. And so I really encourage you to use this day to network. I'm Gabrielle Chapman Stroup, the Scientific Director of SBI since spring this year. Well, not only the scientific director has changed, but also the structure of SBI has changed. As you might know, SBI is now a national research infrastructure. One of the main goals of this new structure is also to enhance access opportunities to polar areas for Swiss-based researchers. Hence, it is not a coincidence that today's program is featuring contributions from 3 institutions which provide attractive opportunities for international collaboration and polar access. But today's program is also a platform for multidisciplinary research and interdisciplinary research. So we'll have presentations ranging from history to ecology, even to atmospheric sciences. And we will conclude the day with exciting news from people who were lucky to go out into the field. And they will hopefully compensate a little bit for those who were not able to go out this year because of COVID. That is really a very difficult situation for many of us, for polar research, because we really are limited in doing our work. Well, in this sense, I really hope that you use this opportunity today to meet new people. My suggestion is that you meet at least 1 to 2 people, you reach out to people that you have never spoken to. So don't stay within your research cluster, but really try to go up to new people, address them, ask them a question. Why are you here? What are you doing? What is your research interest? Why are you excited about polar research? How do you support polar research? I really hope you use this opportunity. And I especially say this because I know that we have a lot of early career researchers today with us. And they, of course, should also have the opportunity to approach everybody without being intimidated, but really just reach out and discuss with each other. Well, without further ado, I wish you an exciting and enriching day. And I now hand over to Daniel Roth, who is the long-standing Executive Director of SBI.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. A very warm welcome also from my side. It's just wonderful to see so many friendly, interested faces this morning. It's been so long, so we're really delighted. And I would like to seize this opportunity. I'm still angry with myself for not doing it last year, to actually introduce you the team of SBI who actually makes things possible in the background, because many of them are here today. So maybe the 2 masterminds of today's event are Laurence and Charmily, so if you just wave. Basile and Nina working in Lausanne at the Secretariat, and Anita, who is one of the 2 persons dealing with the Swiss Polar Class program. So, okay. And because we've been based in Lausanne for the last few years, and this is actually our last year in Lausanne because we will be moving to Sion in the spring 2022, we are particularly happy to be here in the Canton de Vaud, as you can see from the pupitre. And in Lausanne, there are 2 founding member organizations of the SPI, EPFL, and the University of Lausanne. And this building is actually partly also home and history of the University of Lausanne and hosts still part of the university library, as you might have seen. And therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce Niklas Linde, who is the new Dean of the Faculty of Geosciences and Environment of UNIL. And he is himself a geophysicist by training, and he will tell you all a bit in this tradition that we introduce the activities in the place where we are. He will tell you about the priorities and activities of UNIL for polar and high altitude environments.
So thank you, Daniel. Welcome to Lausanne. And as it was already said, it's really nice to see a scientific workshop in place. I think we all needed that. So we're getting back to some sense of normal, and that's really, really nice. I'm replacing our rector, Fredrik Herman. He was supposed to give the talk today, but he's just too busy, so he's excusing himself. And me, as the Dean of the Faculty of Geosciences, I would just like to say a few words. So UNIL is a funder and a member of SBI since January 2020. But the history of polar research at UNIL goes back much further than that. So a few words here. 1895, the professor François-Alphonse Forel, he was initiating, and he was also the first president of the International Glacier Commission. In that work, several professors at UNIL, so there was Frédéric Jacquer, who went to Spitsbergen. He was a paleontologist, but he also worked a bit on glaciers. There was Paul-Louis Mercanton, who I would qualify as a geophysicist, like myself, who worked on glaciology, geodesy. He went to Spitsbergen, Greenland, Jan Mayen, 1910 and onwards. After the Second World War, there was a lot of geologists that worked either in Denmark for the Geological Survey. So apparently at the field mapping at some point, 4 out of 20 field geologists were trained at Lausanne, many PhD theses through the years. There will be an exhibition here at Palais de Rumines starting next year about Greenland, and some of those rock collections and histories will be told. Indeed, the Institute of Geophysics, all the institutes of geology used to be based here in this building some years ago. The Institute Director, Michel Yabriadov, of our Institute of Earth Sciences, is also gathering a lot of historical material that will be provided on our website, unil.ch/iste, in the coming year or so. So long history, but let's now talk a little bit about the present, or the present research of the past. So I just thought about mentioning 3 sort of axes of research at the moment related to SBI. So there's Samuel Jacquer, who is working on climate change in the Russian Arctic. He uses dissolved trace elements and isotopes, and he also investigates the role of sedimentary fluxes to the marine inventory of trace metals. Here you see water sampling, and here you see the Russian vessel that was used this year through an SBI mission. He also worked in the southern Indian Ocean, looking on climate-driven changes in deep ocean circulation, mainly related to the last glacial termination using sediment cores. And here you see core sampling from Marianne Dufresne, the French research vessel. When the glacier disappear, you will be out of your job, but there will also be a lot of sediments and rocks that will be in contact with air and water, and the glacier itself will impact erosion. Erosion will probably, at Greenland, will probably be the highest during the entire Holocene. So how do you actually try to understand the increases in glacial erosion? Well, you like to use numerical models, but to use numerical models, you also need, obviously, data and cores. This is work of Ian Delaney, Fien de Donker, Frédéric Herman, Boumou, Brahim Samba. And here you basically see some ocean sediment cores from the Russian Arctic. works more like classical sedimentology work in Greenland and analysis of decadal variations of erosion on sediment cores. Finally, the other person I'd like to highlight, this is Len Chantelou. She's a cultural geographer, and she works mainly with indigenous people in Quebec, mainly Nunavik, so Quebec and Nunavik, try to understand how they work, and she's doing this in a sort of decolonized approach, a lot of participative videos, photo voice, ethnographic work, a lot of interaction with these people. She organized a workshop about how to do that at present with COVID, mainly together with University of Laval, with which University of Lausanne has a privileged relationship. And she's also involved in some of the future projects. Well, she submitted a project to what's called the Flagship Initiative. We are also at the faculty working a lot in the Alps. Here's just one example. This is the leader image of Aiguille du Midi, part of the Massif Mont Blanc. This is, just to give you a bit of an idea here, there are measurement points about every 10 meters or so, 10 centimeters, with an accuracy of about 1 centimeter. At the moment here, Marc-Henri Desrondes and Michel Diabiadov, they are basically scanning the whole Mont Blanc Massif, so at a very large scale, to create very detailed digital elevation models, and then you can look on changes, rockfall, sedimentation, glacier retreat, and so on. So a lot of work, leader-based work in the Alps. There are many other examples, but that was just one. And I also like to mention the joint center that was launched this year. It's called CLIMACT. It's a center between University of Lausanne and EPFL, and the stated aim is basically to promote change. So it's not looking on just the climate change, but actually acting on climate change. This is done by seed funding. It's done by bi-weekly seminars and a lot of outreach to society. This is a center that is not directly on polar research, but obviously it is related. And maybe just mention here, Nicola Tétrault, he's the executive director. And then there's an academic director at Lausanne, Julia Steinberger, and Mikael Lenning, I think you all know, he's the academic director on the EPFL side. And with that, I'd like to just ask you to enjoy this time, have a good day, and enjoy the fact that you're sort of free to discuss without a screen. So thank you very much.
So I would like to give the floor to you, Hubertus, to introduce Leah.
Okay, welcome everybody. Also a warm welcome from me. My name is Hubertus Fischer, and I'm here in my capacity as the president of the Swiss Polar Commission, of the Swiss Committee for Polar and High Altitude Research, which is kind of representing all of you, for example, in the action with the Swiss Polar Institute, but also with the federal administration, in international bodies, and so on. And it's my great pleasure that I'm allowed to introduce our next speaker, which is Leah Fefli. She studied history at the University of Zurich, where she did her degree, and then she continued with a PhD also in the field of science history at the ETH Zurich, under the supervision of David Gugali. She is the Prix Döckerwe winner from 2020. We're already in 2021 now, and I will say a little bit more about that a little bit later. And so she was winning this prize for her outstanding thesis on science history, especially in the case of Greenland, and we will hear more about her work later during her talk. Now she's a postdoc at the University of Lucerne, where she's working on ethnological studies. One word I would like to say about the Prix Döckerwe and Alfred Döckerwe. I'm not sure that everybody, maybe the younger people, don't know who Alfred Döckerwe was. And I would say he was one of the outstanding heroes and pioneers in Swiss polar and high altitude research. He was one of the first to cross the Greenland ice sheets, and in contrast to many other of his competitors at that time, he actually brought everybody in his team home safe and sound without any casualties. He was the leader of the Earthquake Observatory of Switzerland at that time, and he was also the initiator of the high altitude research station at the Jungfraujoch. So he was actually a genius in all ways of directions. He was a meteorologist by training. And so what better name to give the name for the Prix de Carin, which is the Young Scientist Research Prize that the Swiss Polar Commission and the Jungfraujoch Commission, together with the Swiss Foundation for Alpine Research, provides every day in an alternating fashion. One year we give a prize to polar research, and 1 year we give a prize to high altitude research. And Leah actually won the Polar Research Prize in 2020. As I said already in 2020, now we have already at the end of 2021, and we already have a new prize winners for the high altitude research prize this year. And if you want to know who that is and what they do, then please come to Bern on the 18th of November, where we will have a symposium in the Alpine Museum. And this time, with the new COVID regulations, it actually will take place. And for those young scientists here in the room, there is also the next Prix de Carin 2022 coming up, which will be then again in the field of polar science. And I guess the call will come out early next year. If you want to be in this race, then first of all, your PhD or master thesis has to be completed within the last 2 years, and you have to be nominated. That's usually done by your supervisor. So if you have a really exciting thesis, we are looking forward to read them, and then there will be a selection panel that makes the final selection, and then the prize again will be awarded in November 2022. Okay, without further ado, I would like to welcome Leah to the stage, and I'm looking forward to hear her presentation about her Prix de Carin awarded work on Arctic fever, Swiss-Danish entanglement in the Age of Empire. Leah.
Hello, and thank you for the nice introduction and the invitation to the Swiss Polar Day. I'm very pleased to be here. And first, I wanted to ask if there are other people from humanities here. I've already seen 2 historians that I have met at the conference before. Maybe you can raise your hands if you identify yourself more as historian or humanities. Okay, then I see a lot of people from science, very pleased to this exchange here. And I thought, because many of you maybe have already been to the Arctic, I want to tell you some thoughts about the Greenland dog. Maybe you have already encountered some of them. These thoughts are taken from my dissertation that I have published recently under the German title Arktisches Wissen, Schweizer Expeditionen und dänischer Kolonialhandel in Grönland 1912 bis 15. As Hubertus already told, in the summer of 1912, the Swiss meteorologist Alfred Duquervin and a group of other Swiss naturalists traveled to Greenland. One of their goals was the first crossing of the northern Greenlandic ice sheet from west to east. As a method of transport, the Swiss chose dog sledding. This was not obvious, as other polar explorers operated with other means of transport, like ponies or motorized caterpillars. The archive of ETH Zurich contains a collection about the 1912 Swiss Greenland expedition. It comprises letters from Jens Dagard Jensen, the Danish colonial governor in Greenland at the beginning of the 20th century. He sent them to Alfred Duquervin, the leader of the Swiss Greenland expedition. So probably most of you know, Greenland was already long since a colony, and at the beginning of the 20th century, Denmark held its colony at the west coast and had one settlement at the east coast. The rest of Greenland was not colonized yet at the beginning of the 20th century. So let's talk about these letters. Expertise about dog sledding was one of the key issues in the letters. How many dogs should be taken to the expedition? How many kilometers can they pull the Nansen sled per day? Where to buy the most resistant and healthy sled dogs in Greenland? And how much do they cost? These were the aspects discussed in the letters between Governor Dogard Jensen and expedition leader Alfred de Kervin. Another subject was pemmican. Pemmican is dried meat mixed with fat that guarantees high nutrient content and low weight. Originally used by North American natives, pemmican played an important role in polar logistics from colonial times to Cold War. Governor Dogard Jensen sent de Kervin an offer for pemmican from the Danish company Danske Vin- og Konservenfabrik. The company was specialized in nutrition for polar expeditions. De Kervin ordered pemmican both as nutrition of the expedition team and for the dogs. The food company offered multiple options in their delivery of pemmican. Dogard Jensen wrote to de Kervin. De Kervin could choose between 50 or 60% fat content and small or large pieces. He could choose the sealing technology of the cans and decide how many pieces were packed per cans. The colonial governor Jens Dogard Jensen recommended the Swiss naturalists in the letter further to profit from the knowledge of the Greenlander David Olsen. David Olsen lived in Sarfangvak in Greenland, at the west coast. David Olsen could teach them about dog sledding, Dogard Jensen wrote to de Kervin. So everything of this was in this correspondence between the two in the ETH archive collection. In 1914, 2 years after the expedition, Alfred de Kervin published the travel report Across the Greenlandic Ice Sheet. Chapter 4 of the travel report covers the story of the Swiss encounter with the Greenlander David Olsen. This slide shows pages from this chapter and an image with the de Kervin and David Olsen practicing. The chapter headed, quote, "At the Dog School." The Swiss naturalists had spent 3 weeks at Olsen's house. De Kervin wrote that they had practiced cracking the dog whip, feeding the dogs, and guiding the sled. They had learned Greenlandic commands like "Imatsiak, Imatsiak," slowly, slowly, and studied the different characters of the dogs and the dynamics within the dog group. The daughters of David Olsen, Agathe and Ignar Olsen, had taught the Swiss how to fix the dog harnesses and the little seal fur leather boots that were made for the dogs. What can these stories tell about? It first reveals the entanglement of Swiss naturalists with Danish colonialism. The letters show a friendly collaboration between de Kervin and colonial governor Dogard Jensen. De Kervin sent Dogard Jensen pieces of Swiss cheese as a present, while Jensen stressed in each letter that he was very happy to be at de Kervin's disposal and to answer any questions that might arise. These findings contribute to a debate in Switzerland about its role in colonialism. Switzerland as a state did not have colonial possessions. Nevertheless, actors from Switzerland, like Swiss naturalists, were entangled in the colonial world order. The Danish administration not only supported the Swiss logistically, but also profited from their expertise in glaciology and meteorology. The transfer of knowledge from the Swiss Alps to Greenland helped the Danes to further strengthen their position in the quest of the colonization of Greenland. Second, the offer of Pemicon by Danske Vin- og Konservenfabrikken shows the commercialization of indigenous knowledge. The Danish food company appropriated a technique of Northern American natives. They produced it in Denmark, filled it in cans, and sold it on a grand scale to polar explorers. It shows the specialization and industrialization of techniques of Arctic exploration and the importance of colonial expeditions for the imperial economy. Third, the story of Inuit David Olsen teaching Dykkervæ and the Swiss team how to dog sled shows the importance of indigenous knowledge for the formation of what is understood as Western knowledge. The knowledge of Greenlander David Olsen on dog sledding was crucial for the Swiss Greenland expedition and their exploration of the Greenlandic ice sheet. As I have mentioned, the Swiss naturalist dedicated a whole chapter to the encounter with David Olsen and headed it, quote, at the dog school. Swiss naturalist Dykkervæ described the time at David Olsen as a, quote, prime moment of our expedition, and the skills of dog sledding as, quote, so important, yes, indispensable. While stressing the encounter both rhetorically and in the structure of the book, the correspondence with Governor Dogard Jensen and the business relationship with Danske Vin- og Konservenfabrikken were not mentioned or stressed in the travel report. Swiss expedition leader Dykkervæ imagined dog sledding in the travel report as an entirely Greenlandic technique, without any influence of Western civilization. These findings correspond with another publication of the Swiss naturalist. 1913, the expedition member Hans Hössli, he also traveled with Dykkervæ to Greenland, so Hans Hössli published an article with the title Polar Expedition and Equipment. The article was published in the Journal of the Swiss Skiing Society. He liked to provide knowledge about polar expedition techniques for Swiss alpinism and also for the Swiss military. So he thought maybe polar techniques from Greenland could help also conquer the Alps and furthermore. In this article, Hössli described meticulously where to buy the best dogs in Greenland, how to recognize a good Greenland dog, how to feed the dogs, how to communicate with the dogs, how to prevent the dogs eating of the harnesses, how to repair the harnesses if needed, and how to guide the sled. Again, Hans Hössli valued the encounter with David Olsen. Quote, it pays for itself 100 times to complete a course at his dog school, Hössli stressed. Again, Dogard Jensen and the Danske Vin- og Konservenfabrikken were not mentioned in this article. Dykkervæ and his colleagues took a series of photographs at the expedition in Greenland. Back in Switzerland, they let them colorize and presented them at lectures for the Swiss Academy of Natural Sciences, the Swiss Alpine Club, the Society for Geology at Berlin, and the German Colonial Society. On almost all pictures of the crossing of the Greenlandic ice sheet, dogs were part of the composition of the image, and they were also mentioned in the image captions. So here also dogs are an important motif of this picture. This famous image shows the moment when the Swiss naturalists reached the goal of their crossing, the highest point on the ice sheet. It is highly staged, group picture of the Swiss team. Also again, 2 dog sleds are placed within the frame. The image caption notes, quote, "On the highest point of Greenlandic ice sheet. Kakartok and Silke," these are the names of these 2 sled dogs, "are part of the celebration." So the sled dogs were mentioned even with their names at the caption of this picture. This image stages the expedition leader de Kerva in his role as scientist. He holds an instrument for wind measurement. Here too, dogs are part of the picture composition. The Swiss naturalists were not only interested in glaciology and meteorology, but also in ethnology. They collected human remains and ethnological objects and sold it to the Anthropological Institute in Zurich and different Swiss museums. Passages of the travel report and a part of the photo collection were influenced by ethnological discourse. Inuit were made objects of scientific investigation and described as something opposite to Western culture. A strategy that is described as othering, so the West and the others. In the process of othering Greenlandic people, the Greenland dog and techniques of dog sledding never missed. Dogs and dog sleds were in the ethnological discourse. Dogs and dog sleds were an attribute in the characterization on the figure of the Greenlander. So when describing Greenlanders, the dog could never missing. This anthropological image from the collection of the Swiss Greenland expedition, for example, stages a typical Greenlandic house scene and narrates the cohabitation of Greenlanders and their dogs. Again, the dog is mentioned in the caption of the photograph, that is, Egedesminde, Sophie, Eskimo dog. Moreover, not only the Greenlandic population were an object of othering. Also, the Greenland dog was described in what reads as a typical passage for an ethnological description. Here an example from Hans Hössli's report, Polar Expedition and Equipment, in the Journal of Swiss Skiing Club. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the Greenland dog lived inseparable with their masters, the Arctic people, in mutual dependence. Though they kept a certain wilderness and lupine behavior thereby, which enabled them to tremendous achievements. These pedigree dogs are superior to their adapted cousins at the temperate zones. The Eskimo is not used to walk for hunting. He sleds hundreds, even thousands kilometers with his dogs. But you have to know their type, because at times they are wily rogues and obstinate. How can these representations be interpreted? At the beginning of the 20th century, the Arctic and the Antarctic became a perfect stage for colonial competition. In analogy to other regions like the tropics and the extraterrestrial, the polar regions were imagined as extreme, unfamiliar, sublime, and hostile. The appropriation of the polar areas became a symbol of domination of nature and modernity. In his article about polar expeditions and equipment, Swiss naturalist Hans Hössli referred explicitly to the race to the South Pole of 1911. He mentioned the differences in the expedition regimes of the British and the Scandinavian countries. The British crew of Robert Falcon Scott used Western techniques like ponies and motorized caterpillars, Hössli wrote. The Norwegian crew of Roald Amundsen used Greenlandic techniques like dog sledding. Ponies and motorized caterpillars had been unsuitable under certain conditions, while dog sledding had been the perfect way of transportation in the polar regions, Hössli stressed. This had proved the race to the South Pole. Amundsen had won, while Scott had lost his life. Dog sledding conveyed meanings of a friendly appropriation of local techniques, of collaboration at the colonial frontier, and a modest exploration at the Arctic by white men. I argued that it served as a symbol for Swiss-Scandinavian exceptionalism. Scandinavian countries staged their colonial endeavors in terms of protection and collaboration. By using dog sledding as a motif in their travel report, journal articles, and photo presentations, Swiss naturalists positioned themselves within the Scandinavian discourse of colonial exceptionalism. They dissociated from the British way of empire that was described in terms of violence and repression. For the British way, the Royal Navy, the polar areas had to be conquered by superior Western technology, symbolized not in the Greenland dog, but in the motorized caterpillar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah, for giving us an insight into the history of Swiss research. Thank you very much. So we have time for two questions. I think we even have some people who are also working on sledge dogs, I heard this morning, in the room. Yes?
I was just curious to see that the letters were written in Danish. So Danish? We have someone translating whatever?
No, Nicola could speak Danish, and even like basic skills, and reading the letters was possible for him. Mm-hmm. And he talked also like a few words of Greenlandic. But most Greenlanders at the coast, they also could like speak basic Danish.
Any more questions? Okay. So congratulations
Thank you.
again, Leah, and thank you very much for giving this interesting insight. Thank you. So, well, climate warming poses new challenges to polar areas. One of these challenges is the arrival or introduction of new plants and animal species, potentially outcompeting species that are currently growing and flourishing that are so characteristics to polar areas and their functioning. This is how we see these polar landscapes, what we like and love about these polar landscapes, the species that are actually native right now, up and down there, or however you want to express that. Well, I have now the honor to welcome Tony Martin. He is a professor of animal conservation at the University of Dundee and the Conservationist of the Year, awarded by the Zoological Society of London in 2016. He has spent a lot of his life to think about new species in other areas. And I think it's very important to listen to his message, because we will be confronted a lot with exactly this kind of questions in the future. Please, Tony, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's a joy and pleasure to be with you here in Lausanne. And you may be wondering what an Englishman associated with a Scottish university is doing in Switzerland, talking about a little island in the South Atlantic. The answer is, sitting over there, a gentleman, Frederick Paulson, who likes a challenge. And Frederick is a trustee of the South Georgia Heritage Trust, which is based in Dundee. And Frederick and one or two other trustees came up with this completely ludicrous idea, without any experience at all, of eradicating rats and mice from by far the largest island that had ever been tackled before. And eventually I was asked to do the job, perhaps as a result of the fact that many years before, Frederick and I found ourselves in the bar at Grytviken on South Georgia on New Year's Eve. We were by far the oldest people on the base. All of the youngsters were getting drunk, and Frederick was sitting there with a fine bottle of wine, and he kindly offered a glass to me. It may have been Chateau de Cheval Blanc, I don't know. But we had a conversation which included rats, and eventually, possibly that led to me being offered the post of director of the project. So, let's get going. Oh, my screen here isn't showing what's up there, sorry. Okay, good. So this gives you an idea of what South Georgia looks like for those of you who are not familiar. And as I was flying in here yesterday into Geneva, I was reminded of a description I'd seen somewhere. Someone said South Georgia is like cutting off the top of the mountains in the Alps and dumping it in the South Atlantic. And that's exactly what it looks like. It's a remarkable place. If you haven't been there, I really recommend you save your pennies and get on a ship and go to South Georgia. You won't regret it. So that's where it is, for those of you who are not familiar. It's to the east of the southern tip of South America, and it's just below the Antarctic polar current. So although the latitude is not very high, it's remarkably cold. It's in the path of big icebergs, and by some miracle on this day, an iceberg exactly the same size and shape of Lake Geneva was heading towards South Georgia. I put this on just so that you can see the scale of the island in relation to a water body that you're familiar with. South Georgia is a massive island. It's about 180 kilometers long and 40 or 50 kilometers wide. And the job that I was given was to eradicate every single rat and mouse on this island. With an eradication, if you get 99.9% of the animals, that's a failure. You have to get 100%. That was the task ahead of us. This is a more recent satellite photo. I quite like this. For those of you who are interested in the biology of the polar regions, here it just shows the outflow from the glaciers carrying nutrients into the sea. And it partly explains why the seas around South Georgia are so rich. There's so much krill there that attracts whales and seals, which I'll be talking about. From the air, this is from 10,000 feet. You can get some idea of the island. It's mostly ice-covered, but the coastal regions are just stuffed with wildlife. The most obvious ones are the penguins. There are hundreds of thousands of penguins of 4 species. And when tourists go there today, that's what they're going for, really, the big wildlife. But birds come in all sizes. This is the Wilson's storm petrel. And at bottom left there is the endemic pipit, the world's most southerly songbird. prion, top left, in their millions. And on the right-hand side is a young albatross. If you go around the coast, at certain times of year, you will fall over these great lumps of lard, the most malodorous things you could ever imagine. But they are very abundant, but they were harvested by sealers shortly after Captain Cook discovered the island in 1775. And their ships took with them rats, probably black rats and brown rats. The rats jumped ashore and started munching their way through the wildlife of the island. There were also huge numbers of whales off the coast. There was not the technology to harvest these whales in the early years, but by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, steam-powered catchers were going down to South Georgia and taking vast numbers of whales. About 300,000 whales were killed at South Georgia during the height of the whaling industry in the 20th century. This is the station at Grytviken. This is a fin whale, one of the largest species of whales. It was a massive industry, but again, ships coming in to support this industry brought rodents with them, and they jumped ashore, adding to the genetic diversity of the rats and mice that were already there. Just look at the scale of this. Every catcher there would be killing maybe 5 or 10 whales a day. And if you think that rats are just cuddly creatures, this is footage that was filmed underground showing a brown rat killing a young petrel. And this happens thousands and thousands and thousands of times every single day on islands where there are rats and mice. It's hard to explain to people the difference between an island with and without rats, but imagine you climb up on the side of a hill and at night, and you sit down and you listen. And this was the case on South Georgia until about a decade ago. And what you hear is this: absolute silence. But if you go to an island where there are no rats, you hear, oh, it looks like the sound has disappeared here. Can we get that? Can you click on that? Top left? No, I think the sound's gone. Anyway, believe me, it's a cacophony of sound caused by the prions and the storm petrels, sheer waters, and that essentially illustrates the difference. Islands with rats have almost no wildlife at night. The birds are nesting underground, but once rats are removed, the place comes alive. It's quite remarkable. Can you put that onto the display, please? No, I think he's trying to fix the sound. Good man. Okay, so this is a map of islands around the world with invasive species. These are the red dots, and you can see that this is a problem of global impact. South Georgia, if I can get this little thing going. Oh, what's happened here? Seems to have a mind of its own. I think we should skip that slide. Okay. So this is South Georgia down here. So it's one of the most southerly of the islands with... Go and sort him out for me. Most southerly islands with invasive species. This slide is a bit smaller than it should be, but it gives you an idea of the timeline of the capacity to clear islands from rats and mice. And you can see it's only in the last half a century or so that we've been able to get up to the kind of scale that was necessary for Frederick and his colleagues to think that getting rid of rodents on South Georgia was even remotely plausible. I'm sure they'll fix it. I should say, I've caused the problem because it's my laptop that's running the presentation upstairs. Uniquely, the Brit has caused chaos this day. I'm sorry about that. So you can see that it wasn't until the year 2000 or so that we had the capacity to even think, we globally had the capacity to even think about clearing an island the size of South Georgia. Then we finished South Georgia in 2015, and you can see how massive it was. Subsequently, Gough Island has just been cleared, at least it's been treated the last couple of months, and the next big objective will be Marion Island, a South African island, which they hope to do in a couple of years' time. So the question is, how do you get rid of the bad guys, the rats and mice, without killing all of the wildlife that you're trying to preserve? And the answer is, you need some helicopters, and these were ancient helicopters that had been used for air ambulances in the UK, but they were brilliant on South Georgia. You put a big bucket below them, and you spread rodenticide very thinly, but very evenly over the whole island. And just to give you some idea, in a room this size, or an area this size, we might expect to have 10 pellets of rodenticide. And one of those is a fatal dose. That was the important thing. You can't allow the rodents to have a taste and think, I don't like that, and then maybe get a bit sick and recover. Remember, we have to kill every last one. I have the skin of that rat at home. It did not end well for that rat. So here's the bucket spreading the bait. We put 350 kilos in each bucket load. And this is the spreading. So the helicopters were controlled, or the pilots were guided by GPS. They had lines. The lines on the right here, these straight lines, are the New Zealand pilots. These here are the British pilots. We quickly discovered that the British pilots, no matter how brilliant they thought they were, didn't have the balls to be able to fly up mountains and stick to a straight line. So in the end, we only used the Kiwi pilots. We did the work in 3 phases with 2 years in between, allowing us to raise money for the next phase. So the first one in the center of the island, those of you who are familiar with it, that trial year was that we covered as big an area as any eradication that had ever been done before. Phase 2 was monstrous, 580 square kilometers. And then in 2015, we finished the job down in the south end of the island. So that was now 6 years ago, and by some miracle, I still don't understand it, not a single rat or mouse has been found on the island, with the exception of one, which came off a government ship, can you believe? Unbelievable. Luckily, we got that one. We were able to do the work over 3 seasons because South Georgia is dissected by big glaciers. And so we could bait up to one glacier, knowing that rats and mice would not be able to get back again to re-invade the area we just cleared. This is one of the biggest glaciers that we depended upon. And I'm often asked whether there's real evidence of climate change. Well, here's the evidence. I took this photograph in 2013, and I went back to exactly the same spot in the same helicopter 2 years later. And just remember this mountain here, and look, 2 years later, the ice had gone back. That ice is moving at 1 meter per day. And I had a look at a recent satellite photograph which showed that, in fact, the ice is now way back up here somewhere. Once it gets onto land, then were rats still to be there, they would just run along the edge. So the scale of the operation was huge, 300 tons of bait. We used the Ernest Shackleton to convey everything. We squeezed 3 helicopters into the hold. It's like apocalypse now. It was an amazing sight. And so every year when we arrived, we had to offload all of the bait and the fuel. Seems to be a disconnect between this and what's happening up there. This is the bait in cardboard pods. Each one is 1 helicopter load. South Georgia is an unforgiving place. And at the very beginning of the project in 2015, we were hit by an absolutely monstrous storm, which broke 2 of our helicopters. We only had 3. And we were unable to continue with just 1 remaining helicopter. Fortunately, we had some fantastic engineers who were able to put things together. I should say, incidentally, they couldn't do anything with that blade. But we did manage to get 2 surviving helicopters. And thereafter, it was a matter of loading the buckets by hand and spreading it over the island. As I said, it was all controlled by GPS. Here's our GPS specialist making sure that the load that had just been spread did not leave any gaps. The photographs you've seen make South Georgia look like some idyllic paradise. The simple reality is, of course, very different, and most days it was like this. We would sometimes go 10 days without being able to fly for 1 minute. It took a remarkable amount of dedication and patience by the team. I had 26 people there to get the job done. We had a German film crew with us, and they took, as you could see, things very seriously. This was how we lived. Just fantastic. Just the greatest pleasure of my life. And I'm hoping this is going to have sound. Let's see. No, it's not, but it doesn't matter. Yes, it's very, very low. I think it's just up there. Okay, we don't need the music. There's nothing else. Just enjoy the footage. This was the last day of baiting in March 2015. The pilot in that helicopter is 67 years old, 7 years beyond his normal retirement date, but the best helicopter pilot in the world for work like this. He would get in and strap the helicopter on, and it became part of him. The toxin is called bradificum, and it's the only type of toxin we know that will kill a rodent with a single dose. As I said earlier, we couldn't afford for them to take a bit and then decide they don't like it. Ridificum is 100% effective. This clip is filmed at night in total darkness. Just watch. He knows there's some bait there somewhere. I'm often asked how many rats and mice there were on South Georgia before we started. The answer is lots. We really don't know. It was certainly in the millions, but it didn't matter whether it was 1 million, 10 million, or 100 million. We still had to get every last one. So after the baiting was finished, we would usually have a couple of weeks to clear up, and before the ship would come to collect us, it allowed us to get around to look at areas which we had baited in previous seasons. This was on the northwest coast of South Georgia in 2015, and the penguins, if you're familiar with them, you know they're extremely inquisitive. But remarkably for us, the recovery of wildlife started immediately. There are some birds like the storm petrel here, which the next year started exploring areas of scree for nesting habitat where they had never been seen in living memory. The ducks, another endemic species, were much more productive after the baiting simply because the chicks survived. Previously, the rats would nobble every single chick, or often still while they're in the egg. Whereas after the eradication, it was an absolute transformation. This is a bit of snow under vegetation. All the way around the edge of South Georgia, there's a grass called tussock grass. It's the dominant vegetation. Before 2011, if you walked around the coast, you would see little footprints like this, but not quite like this. We used to see only rodent tracks around the vegetation. And after we did the work, we never saw another rodent track again, but we did see pipits. Pipits are like the canary in the coal mine for us. It's a bird that starts breeding at age 1. It has multiple broods a year, and they disperse a long way from where they were themselves hatched. So it meant that very quickly they could react to the fact that there were no longer horrible rats and mice to eat them. Here is the pipit. And today, if you were to go to South Georgia, and I really hope you will see pipits everywhere. The first thing, when you land on South Georgia today, the first thing you hear is no longer penguins. It's the pipit that will come overhead to investigate you and sing before you can get on with whatever it was you were intending to do. And I've had grown men, gnarly old men, who've been going to South Georgia for many, many years as tour guides. And they've told me that they've come after the eradication, they've gone to a place like this, they sit down on the rock and they cry because the island has been transformed for the better. just in that space of a few years, it's hard to explain what a dramatic impact it has. So, lessons. What have we learned? I think for me, the most important thing is that this, by far the largest eradication project ever carried out, was done by a tiny Scottish charity, not by a government, not by a huge conservation organization like the RSPB. This was a group of 10 trustees with vision and willing to take risks. And they have achieved something of absolute global importance. And it is today inspiring other groups around the world to do similar things. The results were certainly spectacular, and they were almost instant. And today, it's much easier to get money to do work like this because donors like to see quick results. In nature conservation, if any of you work in this field, you know that most things take a hell of a long time. It may be after 10 or 20 years, if you're lucky, you may see results. With this, it's instant. And that's a very, very good thing to sell to prospective donors. The scale of the thing, so when we started, when Frederick and his fellow trustees thought about doing this, they were told that South Georgia was so massive, no one could ever do this. But in fact, the way we achieved the result was just to scale up what had been effective on relatively small islands. If you can get the technique right, then it's just a matter of building up, getting the bigger ship, getting the more bait, getting more helicopters and more pilots, and doing the same thing. But excellence is the key thing. You cannot afford to make a single mistake. Planning and execution have to be meticulous for you to get that final 0.01% that makes a difference between a control operation and an eradication. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Tony, for giving us these insights. So, of course, it has a scientific component, but also a huge logistic component, as you just explained. And, of course, this is also important to SBI, how to run all these logistics, even though we never had a campaign like yours so far. So, do we have questions from the audience to Tony? A lot. Whoa. But we have a lot of time as well, so we'll take quite a few. Please.
Thank you very much. It's really fascinating talk and very good pictures. I'm getting again from the University of Geneva. Actually, I have two questions. One is just very easy. How much of that cost? Then the second one is, did you see the effects? Were there any organophosphates or nitrates in the bloods that doesn't affect the local states?
Two excellent questions. The answer to the first one is it was about $11 million for the entire thing, and that is incredibly cheap pro rata. Frederick is brutal in terms of ensuring that the money that's raised is spent efficiently, and so we did it efficiently. But just to give you some idea, the island of Gough, which has just been covered today, which is I don't know, maybe 2% of the size, it costs more than South Georgia. It was run by a big conservation organization. But South Georgia Heritage Trust had to be lean and mean. And in the case of the rodenticide, it's a very good question. And we looked into this fastidiously, of course, before we started. There's about a 6-month half-life for the toxin brodificum if it's just in water, for example. But when it hits the ground, it starts denaturing pretty quickly. The pellets stayed intact for about 6 or 8 weeks. We designed that given the South Georgia climate. And so we did toxicological tests 2 years after the first and second phase, and there was no measurable remnant of the toxin. So but we did check that beforehand. It wasn't like, oh, thank goodness for that. No, we knew beforehand it should be safe like that.
So are you saying the toxin is rodent specific? Does it mean that you can only use it in places where you don't have other rodents?
No, the toxin is not rodent specific. It kills just about anything, frankly, apart from invertebrates. Certainly it would kill humans. If you had it for breakfast every day for a week, you'd certainly start feeling pretty unwell. It kills birds. And so one of the reasons I think I, as a zoologist, was brought in to lead this project was I was, of course, passionate about not doing long-term damage to any creature other than the bad guys. So we had to find a way to, for example, the color of the bait pellet, the size of the bait pellet, the density of toxin in the bait pellet. We had to find a way which would minimize the chance of doing irreparable damage. And on South Georgia, we had the unique advantage of having 3 years of operation. And in the first year, as I said, we just did a small patch. If we had killed huge numbers of birds, for example, in that first year, we would have stopped. So we were able to look at the effect. There was a panel of experts who looked at this independently, and they said for the second year, yep, no problem, go ahead.
We had other questions in the room. Ed?
Ambitious. The question was, what are my views on the New Zealand ambition to be predator-free by 2050? So, of course, that declaration was made by a politician who is already gone. He certainly won't be around in 2050. So it was a great flag-waving exercise. There's some money going in, but in order to literally to get rid of every possum, every black rat, every brown rat, every house mouse on South Georgia, on New Zealand, there will need to be new technology. And I don't know if anyone here is familiar with gene drives. There's some genetic jiggery-pokery which is going on, and people are now proposing that, for example, house mice are genetically modified and then released into an island so that they will interbreed and the population disappears. That's all well and good as long as those genes never get into the native population anywhere. For me, it's a very scary prospect. But as things stand, they're making progress, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure it's going to be successful unless they bring in this sci-fi eradication work, which makes me very nervous.
There were more questions.
If I heard you right, the question is, how can we be sure that the rats have gone? Is that it? Yeah. How do you prove a negative? The answer is very, very difficult. You may know that in 1982, some Argentines arrived in South Georgia because they wanted to take over South Georgia and the Falklands. We think every Argentine that landed in 1982 is no longer there, but we can't prove it. And similarly with rats and mice, all I can say is that every day that goes by without there being a report of a rat or mouse reduces my anxiety levels a little bit. But until I die, I recognize that at some point I might get that phone call. There are thousands of people that go to South Georgia every year, lots of tourists, scientists, and they're all looking for rats and mice. We do actually get reports occasionally, but invariably they are young South Georgia pintails, the ducks, which are sandy brown color, and they run like hell. And they go between one grass tussock and another, and an uninitiated tourist might think, oh my God, there's a rat. But actually, it's just a cute little duck. But we do investigate. Yeah. So the first question was about the fundraising, and the answer is, I think I'm right in saying 80% of the money came from private donations. The gentleman on my right here and his foundation kind of kick-started that and, for example, was instrumental in getting the first helicopters. And that then introduced confidence to other donors. We had help from thousands and thousands of tourists who go to South Georgia, and they told us they wanted to leave the island in a little bit better shape than when they themselves arrived. So they effectively paid for a hectare or 10 hectares to be cleared. That cost £95, I think, if I remember rightly. So it was a mixture of monies from the private sector, big trusts and foundations, certainly. We got some money from British government through competitive tendering, through something called the Darwin Initiative. So it came in all different shapes and sizes, but we finally got there. Your second question was about other islands that need to be cleared. I was delighted over breakfast this morning to hear that the French are now serious about doing Amsterdam Island. And certainly there are a number of initiatives around the subantarctic zone for people to get serious with their rats and mice. Gough Island just been done. If it had not been done, and we don't know yet if it's successful, there's a species of albatross living there, the Tristan albatross, which would be extinct as a result of an animal this size, mice. And I mean, forgive me if you're an albatross lover, but they're not the brightest birds in the world. And they will sit there while a mouse is eating them while they're alive. And so they needed help. And hopefully those killer mice will now have gone. But for every Gough and Marianne, you find another 5, not only in the southern hemisphere, but also in the northern. There's great work being done in Mexico with tropical islands. I sense an increasing awareness globally that something needs to be done and that it can be done. You need people with vision to say, let's do this. There will always be people saying, oh, we can't, it's too expensive, health and safety. No, find the visionary people who can actually make things happen, and they will.
Yeah, another question over there. Yeah.
Were you concerned about the case of resistance among the population of rats to the invasive? And especially given the size of the island, that it was very big and you wanted to extend activity to other islands of the bigger size?
Talk about resistance to the poison, you mean?
Poison, yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, that's a really important thing. The question is, how do we overcome the possibility that the animals might become resistant to the poison? This goes back to what I was saying earlier. There is just one toxin which we could be confident of because of previous experience elsewhere that would do the job with a single dose. And these rats would sell their grandmothers for one pellet. I mean, it's so attractive. There's some secret ingredient in it which makes it overwhelmingly edible. If we were to have used any of the less toxic toxins, and some people were saying, oh, you can't use brodifacoum, it'll kill everything. But it's hard to explain to people that even if we get 99%, that's not good enough. We had to go for the brutal brodifacoum and deal with the consequences of that, and at the same time be confident that there would be no resistance.
Good. We have 2 last questions we take. First.
On South Georgia, you mean? Yeah, okay, that is a fundamentally important question. How do you keep them out? And I mentioned earlier, a rat came off a government ship. A government ship, can you believe? And that actually, mixed metaphors, that was a rat with a silver lining, if you understand the English analogy there. Because that rat proved to the arrogant South Georgia government the way they do shipping control was completely ineffective. So a group of private individuals had funded and carried out the world's biggest rodent eradication campaign safely, successfully, on budget. And the bloody government introduces a rat 1 year later. But that really caused them to be aware of the problem. There are now dogs checking ships that go to South Georgia, as indeed is the case in New Zealand and Australia, where they've always taken it very seriously. But yeah, getting rid of them is only half of the problem. You have to keep them out.
So the last question from Jerome.
On South Georgia, you mean? Okay, so the question is, are there any other invasive species on South Georgia? In fact, before we started getting rid of the rats, we had to get rid of the reindeer, which were introduced by whalers about a century before. The reason we had to get rid of them is that they would eat the bait that the rodents were supposed to eat. And there we had a bit of a dilemma, a moral dilemma, because we were having to kill Santa Claus's red-nosed helpers at Christmas time. And we could see this being a public relations disaster. But it was a necessary thing. So we had to get rid of the reindeer and then the rodents. And the answer is today there are no invasive mammals left, but the plants are the biggest concern. And however difficult it is to get rid of mammals, getting rid of plants is infinitely worse, I think.
Thank you very much, Tony, and I hope you're available for more questions during the break later on.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, early career scientists are really important to the Swiss Polar Institute, and we support them, for example, through the Polar Access Fund, but also through networking like on this day today. I'm really happy to now introduce Amy Mcfarlane and Nicola Julian. They are standing as representatives of APEX, which is the Association of Polar Early Scientists, Polar Early Career Scientists, of course, here in Switzerland. And they will touch today onto what APEX means for those who are new here and never heard about APEX, but they will also touch upon another challenge that is ahead of us, namely how to make polar research more sustainable. Amy and Nicola, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I hope you can all hear me, but thank you really again for giving us this opportunity to talk at this event and for giving us the time as well. I think it's extremely valuable for us to be given that, so that's the first thing I'd like to say. So I'm Amy and this is Nicola, and we are the new representatives of APEX Switzerland. And we've been in this role for a few months now, and we actually had our first event on Wednesday, which was a huge success. We hosted a data workshop with collaborations with SPI, and it was fantastic. We had about 20 participants, and we are also planning future events. So in the next few months, we're hoping to do actually an in-person event where early career researchers can gather, have a lunch, and then discuss. Our idea would be to discuss the next steps that we can take after PhDs and postdocs, for example. So we really welcome you to join this. So taking a step back, and what is APEX? So APEX as an organization is actually used to assist early career researchers with networking, career progression, outreach opportunities, but we also, aside from that, we do things like poetry competitions and photo competitions, so thank you. So yeah, the scope is really, really broad. And if anyone, I'm aware that I might be speaking to around 50 early career researchers today, so if anyone is interested to join, whether this is just to be on the mailing list or you have an idea for an event, really come and speak to us, because we are quite new to this, so we have quite a lot of energy at the moment, and we really are just absorbing all of this enthusiasm. So if you have any motivation, yeah, really come and join us. So the plan for today is to talk about sustainability in polar research. And I'm sure I'm speaking to a lot of you in the audience who support emissions reduction. But at the same time, we also have this research field which produces a lot of CO2 emissions. So we face in very vulnerable areas. So we face this credibility gap. So how do we possibly talk about reducing sustainability or making our research more sustainable, reducing the impact if we ourselves are also producing pollution? And in this field of work, it's very unrealistic that we're going to be able to cut out all of our carbon emissions. But we also need to try and understand that there are ways that we can change and develop our ideas. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the steps we could take, and hopefully this maybe gives someone in the audience just a little bit of motivation. But really understanding how we can reduce the impact of the work we're doing in this environment. So, yeah, the title being Sustainability in Polar Research, but what does this mean? It's super broad. And actually, sustainability is, sorry. Yeah, thank you, I'll go back one. So actually, sustainability just means that you can keep doing this activity for a long time, for an infinite amount of time. And what I actually want to talk to you about, now I've sat down and really thought about my presentation, is actually do environmentally responsible science. So it's really making sure that we're aware of our footprint and we're trying to reduce it. So, and we already know many ways of doing this. So why am I talking to you about this topic? I know you're thinking, she's doing Apex, but where does this link to the sustainability side? But one thing I'm doing is just showing you that how early career researchers can have a platform through Apex. So I'm very lucky that the Swiss Pole Institute has given me this platform, but there's many opportunities for early career researchers within Apex if you have this, if you have ideas. So also within Apex, there are there are 2 working groups which are also looking at sustainability issues, but then there's other organizations, for example, the IASC, which also has a sustainability working group. So there's other organizations which we're also linked to. So a little bit of background about me, why not? So I am a PhD student and I was working on the Mosaic expedition. Now, for those of you who don't know, this was where we froze a boat into the Arctic sea ice, and I lived on this boat for 8 months, and I conducted research on the ice almost every day. And being in such an environment and working with so many scientists, there was around 400 scientists involved in total, we started to have these conversations on board, we were seeing things that we could change. So when we returned, we got a group together, and now there's around 60 participants of the Mosaic expedition who are involved in these monthly meetings on how we can reduce our impact in polar research. And it started off quite strong. So we had a few meetings, and then we realized, okay, before we actually start to reduce our impact, we need to know what it was. So we were on this huge expedition, and we had no idea, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, what the impact of this expedition was. So the one thing that we are now focusing quite a lot of energy on is to write an impact report with a methodology, so people can use this to then take it away and go and conduct their own impact reports. And impact reports in general are very widely used in industry, and they are actually used as a kind of a measurement before any project is carried out. So it's used as a decision-making tool, and it's used to decide whether this project should go ahead or not. And currently in Arctic research and polar research, there's no fixed requirement for an impact report as such. So it's not done. It takes quite a lot of time. So how do our funding agencies know who to give funding to? Who's doing this sustainably? Who's thinking about these questions? And trying to write this research, this impact report, doing a lot of research in literature, it's really evident that there's no impact report. If anyone finds one, please let me know. But there is no impact report in these Arctic regions of expeditions. So one paper that I was reading recently, which is an article in Science Mag, and it's by Favaro in 2014, so it's not recent. But he talks about animal testing, and bear with me, it's quite an abstract link, but I think we can really learn something from this. And there were no precautions before, so there was really no limit to what animals could be tested on and the number of animals that could be tested on for medical research. So they introduced these 3 Rs. So we have the replace, reduce, and refine. And the replace would be replacing with less sentient animals. So, for example, you replace vertebrates with invertebrates. Or the reducing would be they reduce the number of animals used. It's quite an easy solution. Or the refine is really looking at your research methods and trying to reduce the pain or distress that an animal would go through. So I was thinking, can we do the same in polar research? We could maybe apply these 3 Rs, and at least then we have kind of a focus of how we can work towards this environmentally friendly research. So going back to the replace, can we replace our activities with less carbon-intensive activities? Can we reduce the scope of the activity? Or can we even refine the plan? So this is really maximizing the scientific return for each unit of carbon that's emitted. And I know when I'm coming to you with all of this, I'm obviously quite new to this, but it could be easy. But I think I really want to emphasize that this doesn't have to restrict any advancements in knowledge. Just like implementing these practices in animal testing hasn't restricted any of the medical advances that have been made. So I want to just take a second and talk about the 3rd point, which is the refine. So in the field, one way we can refine the methodologies that we're using is to really look at optimizing our data collection. So this could be in the form of synthesizing data sets with other groups and also using standardization of these data sets. So making sure that the data we're collecting can be easily implemented into modeling, for example. So we're not just thinking about our own individual projects, but really like how is this fitting into the larger scale, even if it's not directly affecting my project. And by doing this, we can start to think about placing a true value on the data that we're collecting. So how, almost quantifying, like how synthesized is this data set? How does it fit into this larger picture? And once we start to quantify this, coming as a scientific perspective, but we can look at this ratio between the data that we're collecting and the impact report that this has. And this, once we start to quantify, it can be used to help decision-making processes. And I think one really important thing giving this presentation is that I want to just bring up the point that sustainability can't be an opinion anymore. It really has to be ways of understanding how this work can become more environmentally friendly. And this all steps back to quantifying the impact, but thinking about this before going on expeditions. Another thing we could do is, taking a step back and looking at these 3 Rs, we could give a value for each of the 3. So, for example, how much does my project reduce, or how much does my project refine, and really start to quantify this, for example. But yes, I think that kind of is the picture I was hoping to paint. But I'm not actually giving this presentation to get answers from the audience, but I would like to just initiate some thought processes amongst you. So I don't know if all of you have your phones turned off, but I was hoping to do a little poll. And so if you could get your phones out, and then we can, set up some questions, which could be, it's all anonymous, there's no pressure. But thank you for listening. I'll be back. So if you take your phones, and then, do you want to?
Yeah, so open your web browser and type in menti.com, and then you're going to be asked to enter a code, which is written there. And then we're going to ask 2 questions, and you can answer whatever you'd like to. And there's going to be a word cloud that's going to be displayed on this screen.
Can you see?
Oh, yeah.
So the code is at the top. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so I'm glad this is working. It's always a challenge when you introduce some technology, but it's going well. So yes, this is exactly what I expected to come up. The points that I wrote down were travel, expeditions, conferences, lab work equipment, and computational power I also thought could be quite a big one. I think someone has, I see computing. Yeah, so this is there too. But there's really a range of contributions to a researcher in polar research. So the question, I guess, could be, how do we apply the 3 Rs to this cloud of words? How do we look at replacing, reducing, or refining these specific topics? And so I can, if people are interested, I can also share this after the presentation if someone has specific interests. Next question.
Yeah, then we're going to go to the next question. So what are the largest barriers you face when making your science more environmentally responsible?
this around so much. What is it? Why can't I Okay, walk around. Yeah. Okay, this has worked really well. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, it's really interesting to see the common words and phrases that are coming up. I think this word cloud has really given us a nice representation of what our barriers are when we come to this. So I'm just going to now talk about how this could link into our 3 Rs. I prepared a little bit. So when we're looking at replacing, so someone wrote lack of alternatives. So is the barrier that we're coming across the technological advances that we're making? And then if so, how do we contact the people who are the providers of our instruments, for example? How do we develop projects which are looking to improve the materials that we use? The barriers for this, though, I mean, it takes a lot of time to test in new instruments. So one example that I could give, just off the top of my head, are these balloon soundings that are used for atmospheric measurements. And there's a lot of talk about making the materials used for these balloons that are released into the atmosphere, using them out of biodegradable materials. But for a long time, to make sure that the measurements that you're doing with these balloons are the same, so we have a really big continuous data set, but you have to release 2 balloons, one with the new material and one with the old material. And the testing time for this is really long. So this is thought of as like a big barrier to making it more sustainable. To reduce, for example, to reduce travel. This is a huge question, because if I'm personally not traveling to expeditions, conferences, other people will do. So will their career progress faster than mine, for example? This is just one idea to pluck out of the word cloud. But how do we overcome this? There's a whole another talk on that. And yeah, so the refinement. Then we can look at the importance of data synthesis, which I mentioned before. But this obviously takes a lot of time before an expedition to plan all of the synthesizing of data. And also it takes costs. So the funding of the time needed to organize this huge data collection and to organize different groups getting involved is a barrier too. And I think, I have no idea what time it is, but I think at that, I can, okay. I'm going to say one sentence more. And this is really for early career researchers, that if you're at a stage in your career where you can question methods, you can get involved with planning these field works or expeditions, really give your opinion, because people are quite open to listening, and I think at this stage it's quite a trendy topic, and it's really a way that we can influence people. Even if you're early career, then I think that's an extremely important takeaway message. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amy and Nicola. Please stay here. Maybe we have some thoughts from the audience. Any questions, any thoughts you wanted to share apart from the Mentimeter?
Yes.
Let me just share some information.
Yep.
As a national operator in France, what we did for the first time last year, our camera footprint, we could define our camera patterns following the right way.
Yep.
And the main conclusion is that 60% of our carbon emission per year is due to our supply icebreaker.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we speak overall for the French horizon about 12,300 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Actually, the travel of people is not that much. When we think about aircraft, Holland, 2011, dry icebreaker is by far the useful.
Yeah.
And if you want to reduce it, it's quite simple. Having the icebreaker delegating at where nuts instead of 14 nuts, and we say half of the fuel. But we need to have our policy maker accepting that we have the ship for a long time. So it's a political decision. But we know how to get it.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. Is this published? Can I?
It's not published. We presented that at the conference meeting.
Okay. Yeah.
And we are still discussing that with other national operators.
Yep.
In the frame of Faro as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be really interested to speak.
And the other aspect I would like to say is exchange of services. I would like to highlight the fact that Spain, especially, was very active in the peninsula to organize the exchange of services between the nations working in the peninsula. And they built up what we call a barter system, so that we evaluate the unit cost of using the ship, using the aircraft, and so on. And that was a big saving. That's something we would like to see on large scale.
I mean, apart from only exchange of services, I think it's also exchange of sampling services by scientists. You know, we have this network of vegetation scientists across the Arctic, and every year before the season, people would send out protocols to really get some samples back from across the Arctic. And it fulfills two roles, you know. One is really, you can really run a nice synthesis across the Arctic, and the other one is that not everybody needs to go to each of these places to be there for few days to do some sampling. So I think that's a good way to go. Danielle, you also wanted to comment about SPI.
Yes, yeah, thank you. This has been really interesting, and I'm really thankful that you took the challenge up of this carte blanche and provoked us a bit. At SPI, we have been trying to think how we can, from our, let's say, rather limited window, at least raise awareness. So we did smaller things like we introduced last year in our application forms questions about how can you reduce, or how you thought about how you can reduce or potentially compensate your impact for your project. This is more to raise awareness than anything else. And as a non-operator, but supporter of access, we are of course dependent on the technologies and the emissions that are actually created by others. There's not much we can do about how a station works that we do not own. However, we can also choose stations according to certain criteria as research groups. And maybe one key I would like to have here, and not to do too much advertisement, but I believe there is also potential for collaboration between those who go in the field and engineers and lots of colleagues in technology fields to actually develop better instruments that maybe don't require so much maintenance, don't require going into the field so regularly, and therefore I would think about the technogrants that is a call open right now, and which where we really hope to see people reach out beyond their community and talk to engineers, talk to people who work on batteries or so on. So this is maybe just a
Yeah. Thank you, Danielle. Any other thoughts? Not really burning right now, so I would like to give the word to Jean-Louis, and thank you again very much.
So just a few words because it's going to be time to eat. So I will invite you to have the lunch and to visit an exhibition that is here at the Palais de Rumines. So regarding the lunch, it's going to take place one floor above ours. So it's at the 5th floor. You can either take the stairs in front of the room or the elevator. There's a reserved place for us to have the lunch, but if you are with a couple of places where you can sit. But if you wish to sit in small groups and really, be quiet in another space, you can take the elevator to the 1st floor, and there's the Senate room that is right next to the elevator where you can sit in small groups. There's a few tables there. Regarding the exhibition, since we have an hour and a half of break during the lunchtime, you can have you'll have the possibility to visit the exhibition Froid. So me and my colleague Laurence will have the tickets. Don't hesitate to come to us to visit the exhibition. I don't think you missed it. It was right in the middle of the center of the building. So don't hesitate also to come to us for any indications. And thank you very much. We'll start once more at 2 o'clock. Thank you.